Good morning, Year 5. Before we start today's lesson, I just want to clear up something from yesterday's task where you wrote the map of the mythology map. One section said portrait of a character, and I asked you to describe a character from the myth. Now, that wasn't very clear of me because technically a portrait is actually just a painting. It's usually a painting of someone's face and head. This is probably the most famous portrait of all time, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. So really, I think actually the job was just to draw a picture of one of the characters, but I asked you to describe a character because I think I was overthinking a bit. Sometimes people say paint a picture of someone and they ask you to describe them. So I think I was seeing the word portrait as a bit of a metaphor there, getting you to describe the character when really I would have, actually I think it was just asking you to paint a picture, literally draw a picture of them. So some of you drew a picture, other people described the character. Either one I'm fine with. I just thought I'd share with you what Zohar did here. Really lovely piece of work. She included all the characters, lovely summary, nice detailed summary. She tried to get that into 5 sentences, and she actually did draw a portrait of Medusa with her snakes for hair, but she also got some description in there as well. Okay, so lovely piece of work there, Zohar, and apologies for the slight confusion. Right, today's lesson, the LO is I can write a persuasive paragraph about the ancient Greeks. So your task today is to write a paragraph to persuade someone that the Greeks were the greatest civilization of all time. Okay? So, you've got to tie together all those persuasive features we've been studying for the last week and a half and put them into a persuasive paragraph. So you're going to be using these features that we've been studying for a while now. Weasel words, that's those vague and wishy-washy words. Emotive language, a language that makes you feel a certain way. Alliteration, so 2 or more words that start with the same letter. A pun is a kind of play on words. A cliche is a kind of a phrase that gets a bit overused. Those two we find tricky, so don't panic if they're not the most important part of persuasive writing anyway, so don't worry if you're finding them hard. Superlatives is when you say something is the most of something or the best of something. A rhetorical question is a question that doesn't really need an answer. Exaggeration is when you just go over the top and you say something is a bit better than it really was. That I'd probably say is the biggest part of persuasive writing, especially in advertising. We see that a lot. And then imperative verbs was those bossy verbs where you're telling someone to do something. So go and visit, look at. Right. So today you're going to write a paragraph about the Greeks, but I'm going to show you how to do it by writing about the Romans. The Romans was that civilization that came from what is now Italy, and they came after the Greeks. So they actually borrowed a lot from the Greeks. So there's Greece, there's Rome, but they were another great civilization. So I'm going to try and persuade people that the Romans were the greatest civilization of all time, and then you are going to write a paragraph about what made the Greeks the greatest civilization of all time. So you feel free to borrow some of the language I use, but I will model how to do that now. So I'm going to try and persuade you by looking at 4 features of the Romans. So their empire, that's the land that they conquered. The Colosseum and their architecture, they were great builders. The Colosseum was like a modern day, like an ancient Wembley Stadium where sports and gladiator battles would happen and spectators would come and watch. The Romans were very well known for the roads they built, and they also had a very well organized and powerful army. So I'm going to use those 4 features to try and persuade you that the Romans were the greatest civilization of all time. So here we go. The structure I'm going to follow, I'm going to do a short introduction, and then I'm going to try and write 2 sentences for each point I make. So 2 sentences on the Roman Empire, 2 sentences on the Colosseum, etc. And I'm going to try and finish with a pun. Okay, so let's make a start. And also let's keep going back to these features here. I'm going to try and use all of these features here. Right, here we go. Have you ever wanted to know what let's make that a bit smaller. I've got lots to write. What the greatest civilization of all time was. So we've got there, we'll open with a rhetorical question. Well, look no further. everybody knows that, everybody knows that the Romans beat all the competition. Okay, so what have we done there? We've got a rhetorical question. Look no further. That's an imperative verb. It's a bossy verb that you're telling we're telling someone, look no further. Everybody knows. That's weasel English, isn't it? Weasel language. Everybody knows. It's a bit. Does everybody know? Well, not necessarily. That the Romans beat all the competition. It's a bit of a cliche, that. Okay. So that's our little introduction, and then we'll go into some details. So we're going to try and write 2 sentences for each point we make. So one to introduce the idea, and one to give more to sort of fill out the point. The Romans were powerful conquerors. So an introductory sentence. Powerful, I suppose that's emotive language, isn't it? At its peak, fronted adverbial, the Roman Empire stretched from Egypt in the south to Britain in the north. Okay, so let's just correct my mistakes there. The Romans were powerful conquerors. At its peak, well, yeah, that's basically, that is a bit of a weasel language. That it wasn't always that large, was it? So we're judging it on when it's at its largest. So at its peak, the Roman Empire stretched from Egypt in the south to Britain in the north. Let's move on to our next point. Let's talk about their architecture. The Romans were the most ambitious architects. Architects are people that build things. Okay, so we've got a superlative here, haven't we? The most ambitious architects, more ambitious than everybody else. Visit the Colosseum, that's that building in the other picture, the big stadium, in Rome today, and stare in awe at the magnificence of their building skills. Okay, so what have we done here? We've said they were the most ambitious architects, and then we've got an imperative verb here, a bossy verb. Visit the column in Rome today and stare in awe. So to stare in awe is to basically stare in amazement at the magnificence of their building skills. So I suppose that's emotive language, isn't it? If you're staring in awe, you're sort of standing there with your mouth wide open going, whoa. Okay, so it's 2 sentences on their architecture. Let's talk about the Roman roads now. The Romans pretty much invented roads. So, pretty much invented roads. Well, they were famous for their roads. I don't know if they invented roads, because roads have been forming for thousands of years, just the paths that people travel on, aren't they? So we've got some weasel language here, pretty much invented, so we're getting out of telling the exact truth there. And then saying that they invented roads is a bit of a stretch. I mean, they did build some wonderful roads, but to say they invented them might be a bit of exaggeration. Next time your car takes you swiftly from A to B, that's from one place to the next, that's what that means, so a bit of a cliche that, comma, thank the Romans for their ingenious, what have I done wrong there, one end, for their ingenious road building skills. Now we've already used building skills here, so let's road building talent, shall we say. Okay, so again, 2 sentences. So one to introduce it, the Romans pretty much invented roads, and then another sentence to fill out the point. Next time your car takes you swiftly from A to B, thank the Romans for their ingenious road building talent. So what we're doing here, we're telling the reader to thank the Romans. That's basically saying you've got them to thank. It's emotive language, it's connecting the reader to what we're writing about. So it makes the reader feel connected to the Romans. And actually, it is true. There are roads. There are still roads and routes today in Britain, in this country and across Europe, which were originally Roman roads. So there is some truth to that. Okay, let's come to the end now. So last but not least, who can forget the Roman army, ? With its clever tactics and fearsome centurions. A centurion was a type of Roman soldier. Oops. The Romans were a force to be reckoned with. Right, what have we done there? So, last but not least, I'd say that's a cliche. It's a bit of an overused thing. It's a bit cheesy. It's a bit of alliteration, that as well, isn't it? Last but not least. Even though there are two words that don't begin with L there, it's still got that ring to it. Okay, last but not least. Who can forget the Roman army? Who can forget the Roman army? That's a rhetorical question. We don't need an answer. With its clever tactics and fearsome centurions, we've got some nice expanded noun phrases there. Fearsome centurions, I suppose that's emotive language, isn't it? Trying to get you to feel some kind of fear. The Romans were a force to be reckoned with. That is a cliche. It's a bit of a cheesy phrase, a force to be reckoned with. It's also weasel English. What does that mean? Does that really mean they're the greatest army ever? Just saying they're a force to be reckoned with. It's weasel language. It's a cliche. Okay. And finally, I'm going to try and end on a pun. Now, puns are really tricky to come up with, but you need to think of Roman words, Roman, and what does it rhyme with, and can we link it to a cliche or something? So I'm going to put the Romans, and then Rome is where the heart is. Now, the saying is home is where the heart is, so we've turned that into Rome is where the heart is. It's not very impressive English. It's a bit naff. It's a bit cheesy. Honestly, I don't think puns are the most important part of persuasive writing, but it's useful to teach you the concept of what a pun is. I don't think it would make your writing brilliant, but we've got a bit of a pun in there. It's a bit of fun. The Romans, Rome is where the heart is. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Follow that structure for your text about the Greeks. Now, I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to tell you what you need to do next. I beg your pardon. So your task today is to write a paragraph to persuade somebody that the Greeks were the greatest civilization of all time. Okay, so you're going to do something similar to what I just did there about the Greeks. So you're going to follow this structure. So write a quick introduction saying the Greeks were the greatest or something like that, and then 2 sentences for each point. Now, I think you could mention the Greek Empire, ruled by Alexander the Great. You've got Greek democracy, so they invented the concept of voting for who your leader is. Of course, who can forget the Olympics? There's Greek mythology. You should know lots about that, because we've studied several Greek myths now, haven't we? But also, if you didn't want to write about them, there are some other things you could write about. There are the Greek gods, the words and language that we still use today, their magnificent architecture, some of their inventions that some of you have studied. So there are other things you could use, but I think 4 things to mention is probably enough. We've got the different features that we need to try and use there. Don't panic if you're struggling with puns and cliches. I'd say they're less important, but these other ones I think you could use. And yeah, so something I'll just tell you quickly here. The Greek Empire at its peak was ruled by someone called Alexander the Great. So he was from this part of Greece, Macedonia, and he was very young. He was in his early 20s when he conquered all of this area over here. So his Greek Empire actually reached as far as India, but it didn't last for very long. As soon as he died quite young. He got ill. It sort of fell apart and broke up into different nations. So you don't need to mention that, because you're going to exaggerate and mention that at its peak, the Greek Empire stretched from Macedonia in the west to India in the east. You don't need to mention that it fell apart very soon after that. Okay. So yeah, you can use my text here as a guide, but do something similar for the Greeks and try and persuade someone that the Greeks were the greatest civilization of all time. Right, thanks for listening. I look forward to reading your pieces of writing. Bye.